All right, welcome everyone to this meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman Chapter in Vermont. Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, before we get started this evening, I just want to go to the membership here this evening and ask if there are any news and notes on projects or endeavors anyone has undertaken as we go forward. I know Jeff is still working with his podcast, Baseball and Barbecue. Are you doing a Jeff? You can unmute for a second if you would, please. Are you doing a interview for the podcast this evening?
Yes, I am. I'm going to be interviewing Rene LaRue, who is the you heard of Rene? Yeah, the New York State Baseball Hall of Fame. He runs the induction ceremony. Has actually built a actual physical museum in Gloverville, New York. So we're going to be interviewing him, and I'm going to be attending the induction ceremony on November 10th.
I actually got the chance to tour it before it opened
to the
public last time I was out.
Nice.
That way, it's just wonderful. Got a chance to see the stadium across the street now that it's redeveloped. It was beautiful. So,
and the podcast that we're dropping on this Saturday, the 28th, is going to be with Eric Sherman, who wrote a book with Dewey Evans. So
nice.
Check that out.
Nice. Baseball and Barbecue available on every podcatcher that's out there. If you are not listening to that, download it today. Dixie, you're up.
I've got 2 game stories in the games project pipeline.
Nice.
I've got a story in the upcoming edition of the 19th Century newsletter and another one in the Dead Ball newsletter, and I'm working on 3 bios.
Well, Dixie's not letting the dust settle anywhere. You want to give us any indications as to what you're working on, or you keep it a secret?
Okay, you can ask yourself this question. Who was the player who struck out the most times in the 19th century?
Oh, Lord. Anybody?
I was going to say Ellie De La Cruz because he has so many this year, but no, that's not the answer.
That's one of the guys I'm working on.
Oh, okay.
Are you interviewing him?
I don't think so.
Alex Day says Bugs Bunny.
I'd like to. I'd like to interview all the editors of all the newspapers who screw up research.
Dixie, is it Kilroy?
Well, no. It's the player who struck out the most, not the player who struck out the most batters the most.
Sorry, I messed it up.
That's all right. It's a tricky question.
I have no idea the answer to that question.
No one does.
Okay, so we'll wait for the bio to come out. How's that? Okay. All right. Well, at last week's board of directors meeting, an amendment to our chapter bylaws was discussed, reducing the number of days a ballot will be held open in our next election in 2025. The board is recommending members vote in an upcoming special election to take the number of days from 30 to 14. This ballot will be released to membership next week. Please look for that in your inbox. If you have any questions about that, please email me directly at bruce@brucemcclurenh.com. Now, also, if you're in our neck of the woods, make plans to attend our in-person meeting this Saturday, September 28th at 12:30 p.m. here at our home in New London, New Hampshire. We will be enjoying an afternoon of burgers and dogs and a discussion of the fantastic new book, Locker Room Talk, A Woman's Struggle to Get Inside. Titan of journalism and amazing author, not to mention SABR member, Melissa Lutke will be with us. While sports writers rushed into Major League Baseball locker rooms to talk with players, MLB Commissioner Bowie Kuhn barred the lone woman from entering along with them. That reporter, 26-year-old Sports Illustrated reporter Melissa Lutke, charged Kuhn with gender discrimination, and after the lawyers argued Lutke versus Kuhn in federal court, she won. In her 1978 groundbreaking case affirmed her equal rights, and the judge's order opened the doors for several generations of women to be hired in sports media. For information on how to attend this rare opportunity, email me directly today. It's going to be a great weekend of weather, and it should be a wonderful, wonderful time for us to get together to experience this book. And now for our feature presentation. The first Negro National League, 1920 to 1931, consisted of 8 core franchises that played at least 6 league seasons. The Birmingham Black Barons, the Chicago American Giants, the Cuban Stars West, the Detroit Stars, the Indianapolis ABCs, the Kansas City Monarchs, the Memphis Red Sox, and the St. Louis Giant Stars. 15 additional franchises each competed in no more than 2 NNL seasons, including 6 ephemeral teams based in Cleveland. Statistical analysis of the core franchises, roster management, and evolution reveals varying degrees of how aggressively and effectively they addressed their roster needs. This analysis is presented in relation to the terms won-loss records, runs scored, and runs allowed in this presentation. A recently retired botanical garden chief executive and professor of botany and horticulture, Clem Hamilton focuses his baseball research on how dynasties are created and maintained, with particular attention to successful franchises in segregation-era black baseball, and on promoting induction of more black ball personnel into the Hall of Fame. In 2022, he won the Jim Rygelski Research Award from SABR's Bob Brogue St. Louis chapter. And he is here tonight to give his presentation, Roster Management and On-Field Success in the First Negro National League. Clem Hamilton, welcome to Northern New England. How are you?
Terrific. Thank you very much. So that's pretty much it. Any questions?
Moving on.
All right.
We'll see you next week.
Okay. Okay. So let's just go launching ourselves directly into the PowerPoint, which, if I remember your very good tutorial, Bruce, I'm hitting the share screen.
That share button down the bottom.
It looks like,
and then you find your presentation.
Where is the screen that has the full bore? I've got this screen.
Is your PowerPoint open?
I believe so. And the answer to that is yes.
So you'll click share.
Oh, I see. There you go.
You'll find your presentation. Click that.
I happen to have it on the very last slide.
We are trained professionals, folks. Trained professionals.
Hang tight. We're going to do the end show. Take it all the way back.
Bear with us just a moment.
With how I can navigate this stuff. Okay, so now let's tell me if this is okay. Come on, Clem, you can do it.
Share.
I'm getting back. Okay, there's the Zoom screen. Come on.
Can anybody sing? Can anybody sing? A couple of bars to take me out to the ball game.
Okay, now I'm on the screen that just says Zoom. So did I inadvertently foul something? Here's something else. Yay, maybe. Zoom meeting.
Look at you.
Hey, there we go.
Now hit from beginning up top there where it says from in the toolbar where it says from beginning.
In the toolbar where it says from
beginning, all the way over to the left, all the way over to the left. There it is. Click that.
All right.
And that should there you did it.
Rookie of the Year award. Thank you. Okay, good. Now we're rolling. First thing you will notice is the title is different from what I presented at Cooperstown at the Malloy meeting, mainly because as I was putting this together and making a few improvements to it, I noticed some of my stories were outside of the scope of the previous title. I mean, who would notice but me, but that's okay. So there we are. And so we'll launch with a nice little quote here from the historian David Hackett Fisher. History is a problem-solving discipline, blah, blah, blah. And the last phrase in the form of an explanatory paradigm. So if you get all excited and thinking that's what you're going to see, well, let's say that that's just my ultimate objective. What you're going to see tonight is more under the heading of tidbits. Some interesting tidbits, some big ones and some little ones, and all original, or if they're not original, better quantified than we've seen in the past. So my overarching questions, whether we're talking about the St. Louis Cardinals, my current home team, or the St. Louis Stars, or the New York Yankees, or the New York Botanical Garden, are the following. One, How and why do some organizations achieve sustained success? And number two is probably a subset of that. That is, how aggressively and purposefully did teams manage their rosters? So we'll see that most of the stories in the talk will relate directly to those questions. So before we get into the Negro National League, or rather the first Negro National League, 1920 and 1931, introduce a couple of statistics that I will use a great deal, drawing on my background as an applied botanist, ecology, conservation biology, and whatnot. These are two indices of similarity that both range between 0, two things being completely different, to 1.0, where they're identical. I mean, in my career, I use them to compare forests and prairies, but you can use them to compare, oh, I don't know, gastrointestinal flora, whatever you want to compare. And of course, I'm using it to compare baseball teams from year to year. The Sorensen index is a real simple one, and that is it measures the similarity of the roster. And then Morisita's gets more complicated in that it incorporates the appearance frequencies, plate appearances for position players, and innings pitched. As I say, they range from 0 to 1. Couple of, for instances, say looking at the St. Louis Stars, comparing 1925 to 1926. In both cases, the position players numbered 10. There were 7 overlapping guys. And so the Sorensen index at the is 0.70. It makes nice intuitive sense. Now the Morisita's index is a bit higher, which reflects the fact that most of the shared players are toward the top of the frequency distribution: Cool, Papa Bell, Dewey, Creasy, and so forth. So that gives you a little sense. Oh, here's another example, a little bit different, comparing pitchers from the Stars from 1926 to 1927. You can see a good deal less overlap. 6 significant pitchers in 26, 8 in 27, only 3 is overlapping, produces a Sorensen's index of 0.43, a pretty low level of similarity, showing a great deal of upheaval in the roster. And the Morisita's index is considerably lower than that. Oh, something I'm seeing. Bruce, help me, or Molly, help me out, please. The people's pictures are on the right side, and it's obscuring part of the slide. What can
we see the slide just fine. You go right ahead, Clem.
No,
I know, but I don't.
No, I understand what Clem is saying. Clem, you can actually move those pictures. So if you go up to the top of the bar where the grid is, and you
Right?
click on that, you can move your pictures.
Oh my goodness, so I can. There it is. Thank you. All right, that solves that. Okay, so now you have an idea about the similarity indices. If you have trouble remembering it, just think of the phrase S&M, and that'll be real straightforward. Another little tool I'll use is just to show rosters so we can see some pretty pictures, know what these guys look like. You know, the catchers, the infielders, the outfielders, and then sometimes I'll put the pitchers on the right side of the diagram. So let's launch ourselves into it then. So as we look at the years 1920 through 1931, as Bruce said in reading the abstract, we've got 8 teams that are significant that played at least 5 of the 12 seasons, and we've got a good number of peripheral ones. The most interesting stories are relate to the 3 primary successful franchises: CAG, that's the Chicago American Giants; KCM, the Kansas City Monarchs; and SLG, which in 1922 becomes SLS, St. Louis Giants, becoming the St. Louis Stars, who become an excellent team later in the period. Now, there we go. So, as I say, Chicago American Giants, you can see how they were doing very well at the beginning. Of course, Rube Foster was their manager. He's the guy who actually launched the Negro National League. Funny story about that is that they met in the winter prior to the 1920 season, and they were the owners of various teams who were interested in creating a new league. And they figured, okay, we're laying the groundwork and we'll get started in 1921. And as they got to laying the groundwork, they figured, oh, hey, we're making this work. Let's go ahead and launch it in 1920. So Chicago was on top of things for the first 3 years, a slight decline, and then a really interesting story. going from 1925 through 1927 before their decline. Again, we'll come back to that. The Kansas City Monarchs are the most consistently good team throughout history. You'll notice that they don't show up in the column for 1931 because actually in the second half of 1930, they concentrated the vast majority of their activity in barnstorming with their snazzy new portable light system, and they made a whole lot more money doing that than playing league games, especially given the impacts of the Great Depression. And then they abandoned the league entirely in 1931. And then finally, as I said, the St. Louis Giants and St. Louis Stars. And the most interesting story for them relates to the years 1923, 24, and 25. And as of 1925, they became this very good team, a semi-juggernaut through the rest of the life of the Negro National League. So let's see how those statistics play out. So the Chicago American Giants, Kansas City, the top tier, you can see that they all had terrific winning proportions, what some people call win percentage. That makes my skin crawl, but that's all right. And you see fairly high numbers of players that played with the teams for at least 6 seasons, 9, 11, and 10, relatively speaking. And look at Kansas City. They had only 51 significant players in that entire time, which is another indicator of how consistent their team's rosters were over all that time. Now, on the right side, you see the columns relating to the similarity indices, first for the position players and then for the pitchers, and there are the numbers. But first, I'll draw your attention to the numbers in the lower right-hand corner. These are the league averages. So 0.62 is the average Sorensen's index for the entire Negro National League. How much did rosters change from season to season? And you notice the Sorensen index number is lower than the other, which tells you that most of the upheaval were in the Scrubinis, whereas there was more consistency in the guys who had the greater number of plate appearances. And for the pitchers, likewise for the higher numbers of innings pitched. And you can see for the pitchers, generally those indices are lower by about 0.1, ranging from 0.53 to 0.59. If you send your eyes back up to the upper right-hand corner and look at Chicago, Kansas City, and St. Louis, you'll see all of those numbers are considerably higher than the league average, except, interestingly enough, Chicago of their pitchers. And as we'll come back to in a few minutes, their stock in trade was run prevention, much more than run scoring. I mean, they played a very old style John McGraw-ish type of baseball. Well, I guess it was contemporary, so you wouldn't say it was old style. But they still had a pretty high turnover in their pitchers roster composition, which is still something of a mystery to me. Okay, so now we will look at the other 5 teams, just give you thumbnail sketches about them, and then turn our attention back to Chicago, Kansas City, and St. Louis. So the Detroit Stars, you can see, pretty successful team. In fact, if I were writing for if there had been a Street and Smith baseball magazine for the Negro National League in the 1920s, I would be tempted to write every year, this next season is going to be the year that Detroit finally breaks through. Well, obviously that did not happen. They had good players, but you will see, look at that number of significant players, 91 over the course of 12 seasons, and only 7 of them, headlined, of course, by the great Turkey Stearns, that played at least 6 seasons for the team. So a great deal of turnover, also obviously reflected in the similarity indices, which are lower, in fact, for position players, even lower than the league average. And there's a team that was perfectly respectable, but they just didn't maintain too much continuity. In fact, if you look at their history, key column here, well, it speaks for itself. You see their win-loss records and winning proportion and what position they were. Oh, and by the way, this is their winning proportion over the entire season. Most of the years, the season was divided into 2 halves, with the winner of the first half playing the winner of the second half in a league championship series for those years where they were 2 different teams. Anyway, so those 2 center columns got average runs per game, average runs against, and in honor of the current election, if the numbers were considerably better than the league average, I have them highlighted in blue, and if they are considerably worse than the league average, they're highlighted in red. Okay, subtle reference, my last one to the current political state. And you can see how from season to season, those indices just stayed pretty low with a few nice exceptions. In fact, my favorite season is the 1930 season, where they actually won the second half championship, barely lost the league championship to St. Louis. And you think, man, they're on their way. 31 is going to be great. And they just couldn't hang on to anybody. In fact, their whole pitching staff left. In fact, the article that I wrote about it, I gave it a Hemingway-esque cast and called it A Farewell to Arms. Thank you. All right. So the theme for Detroit, no sustained cumulative improvement. Okay. Next interesting team to talk about is the Indianapolis ABCs. Indianapolis was very good in 19 teens. In fact, Indianapolis and Chicago were the two primary teams in the Midwest, had a heck of a heated rivalry going. And you can see how their success plummeted considerably. In fact, you notice in highlighted in green what I call ABC 1.5 in the various baseball reference and so forth. It's considered to be the same franchise as what came before, and actually that's a bit of a misnomer because they were kicked out of the league in the second half of the 1923 season, and then a whole different group that in many years, there were two different Indianapolis ABCs, and a fellow named Walter Jewell ran kind of the secondary one, independent of each other, and he went to the Negro National League and said, I'd like to put a team together. So it was a different franchise and actually had some success in its second year of existence. So as you would expect, very low numbers in the similarity indices. In fact, really low numbers. What the heck is going on? How could such a successful franchise go down the tubes like this? And it turns out, take a look at this. Okay, I'll explain what we're looking at. 1922, really good season, finished third in the league, and were above average in both runs scored and runs allowed. And then why did they lose all their players? Well, or the vast majority, including the entire pitching staff. Well, C.I. Taylor, who was the Rube Foster equivalent of the Indianapolis ABCs, he passed away. The team went to his wife. There were issues with that. In fact, Paul DeBono wrote a really good book, his account of the Indianapolis ABCs. I highly recommend. And so you see this year after year, they somehow put together, at least in 1923, they still put together a decent team. They played well and they lost most of their players. This is the most heavily rated team franchise in the history of the Negro Leagues. And as I said, 1924, they didn't even finish the season because they couldn't pay their bills. Rube Foster kicked them out. And then you had the new franchise in 25 and 26. So that's the story in a nutshell. And just so you can see, I'm going to whip through these diagrams just so you can see how many people went bye-bye. 1922, I mean, my goodness, you had Oscar Charleston playing center field. You had Biz Mackey in the Hall of Fame. He's one of the catchers. Ben Taylor, one of the Taylor brothers, he's playing first base. William Ross, an excellent pitcher. This was an awfully good team. Boom, look how many people got rated by other teams, especially Eastern teams. This was before the Eastern teams and the Eastern Colored League reached an agreement with the Negro National League to reduce the amount of rating. And the same thing happened next year, actually, a whole lot more. Look at the disappearance after the 1923 season. Okay, enough of that. Now we turn our attention to the Cuban Stars. Cuban Stars West, CFSW, which implies there was a Cuban Stars East, which there was. There's one difference in there that is not a typo. In 1921, you see that abbreviated CS. They were just the Cuban Stars, and that was the only year they actually had a home. They were based in Cincinnati. All the rest of the years, they were a barnstorming team. As you can see, never very successful at all. Their best year was actually 1920. As you can imagine, a pretty high level of turnover for them. I mean, not as bad as Indianapolis, but you can see only 2 guys played at least 6 seasons for them. No big surprise there. Now, the really interesting story here. This just shows the 1920 being their best season. A whole lot more red than blue for them, especially when it comes down to run scoring. Now, the really interesting story here, and somehow or another that top line is getting in the way of my seeing the top of this. That's okay. I know what it was. So the left-hand 4 columns relate to the Cuban Stars West. This is a franchise that dates back to before 1910. Abel Linares, a Cuban, a baseball entrepreneur, and very active in the Cuban Winter Leagues. He was recruiting players from the Cuban Winter Leagues to go north and to become the Cuban Stars. Now, Alex Pompez, a name that might ring some bells. I think he's also in the Numbers Running Hall of Fame, if there were such a thing. In 1916, he started a Cuban Stars team based in the East, and it took a few years before they were as good as or better than Abel Linares' Cuban Stars. But in that first year, 1916, there was a challenge game between the two, and even though Linares' team was better, as so happens so often in baseball, the Pompez's team prevailed in that and gained the instant credibility. And as you can see in the 1920s, with either playing independently or as part of the Eastern Colored League, Pompez's Cuban Stars East performed a heck of a lot better. And something that's been hypothesized, but I'm not aware of anybody quantifying it before, one of the key elements, I mean, Pompez was part of what that column there is Cuban diaspora. Okay, a lot of Cubans moved elsewhere: Nicaragua, Mexico, Key West, Tampa, Spanish Harlem, and Pompez, being one of those guys, was a whole lot more effective at getting outstanding players from those other countries, whereas Linares was recruiting entirely, or all but one, of players from native to Cuba in the strict sense. Let's see, there we go. So here's the question: could these 2 Cuban defined teams in the major Negro leagues have been better? In other words, did they fail to recruit some good, potentially difference-making Cuban players? And I took one little period, 1920 to 1924. In that period, 67 players played significantly in the Cuban Winter League. Of those, 49 played summers in the major Negro leagues, almost all for the 2 Cuban Stars teams, not Jose Mendez or the great Cristobal Torriente, Mendez with Kansas City and Torriente almost entirely with Chicago. So the question is, did the other 18 players represent missed opportunities to have significantly improved Cuban Stars teams? Why didn't these guys play major Negro League ball in the U.S.? Some of you may be anticipating the answer to that question, and here you're seeing pictures of 10 of them. Names you'll recognize: Dolph Luque, Armando Marsans, Rafael Almeida, so on and so forth, Oscar Tuero, Miguel Gonzalez and the Mike Gonzalez in the lower left-hand corner. What do they have in common? They're white. So they indeed were coming up into North America, to the United States, to play ball, but they were playing major league or minor league, so-called organized baseball. So the conclusion is there were not enough outstanding, dark-complected Cuban players. Did you just hear the thunder that just happened here? I bet it came through my microphone. Anyway, there were not enough outstanding, dark-complected Cuban players to sustain 2 competitive Cuban-defined MNL teams. And it's kind of appropriate that Miguel Gonzalez, later in his scouting days, originated the term good field, no hit, because that, to a large degree, describes the state of Cuban baseball relative to their North American pals. All right, enough of that. Oops, I want to push that button. No, there we go. And now we turn our attention to the Southern teams, the Birmingham Black Barons and the Memphis Red Sox. Much of their career playing in the Negro Southern League, and you'll notice in that first year, 1923, they're in parentheses. They were affiliate members, and then they became full-fledged members the next year. Never dreadfully successful. In the one year, you'll see they did play in the league championship series because they won the second half. Birmingham's real glory years were in the 1940s. Memphis was always inferior, and you'll notice the gap in 1926. This is actually kind of interesting. So no great surprise. You had pretty high turnover for them. They also got rated by other teams. The other teams would come down to play them and say, "Hey, I sure like this fellow," and make him an offer he couldn't refuse. And there are the histories of the two teams, with the 1 year that was good for Birmingham and no particularly good years for Memphis. And here's the interesting story. So after 24 and 25, the two teams and the Negro National League both agreed that there was such a financial burden of travel costs for both the southern teams and for the more northern teams to go down there, that it just didn't make sense to have them as part of the Negro National League. So they went back and joined their former brethren in the 1926 version of the Negro Southern League. They stopped all the competition in there. They wound up playing each other, and Birmingham won. And so the civic boosterism sort of overcame financial good sense, and they were back in the Negro National League in 1927. Now, about half of the team's players, or slightly under half, had actually, when the Southern teams went back in 1926, they wound up hooking up with other major league teams, but half did not. But when the teams came back in 1927, the league pronounced that all of the teams that left Birmingham and Memphis would be returned to them for the 1927 season. Did that indeed happen? Well, sort of. There were 11 such players. 5 of them were returned to their teams, and 6 remained with the teams they had joined in 1926. From my St. Louis perspective, I'm very happy to report that Mule Suttles and John Henry Russell were 2 of those, turned a very good team into a great team. And for the Chicago American Giants, the most noteworthy, I mean, they were all 3 were starters, but Pythias Russ, the catcher, who became a star shortstop. So I continue to search, but so far in vain, for any mention of St. Louis or Chicago or Kansas City reimbursing by giving them players or cash or anything else to Birmingham and Memphis to make up for the players that they lost. Just an interesting little historical tidbit there. And then just a moment on the ephemeral teams that play just a little bit as a 9-year botanical garden hoity-toity in Cleveland. I'm embarrassed to say that Cleveland had 6 of those ephemeral teams, pretty much most of them start with the letter C in the abbreviation. The Cleveland Tate Stars, the Cleveland Browns, no kidding, the Cleveland Elites, the Cleveland Hornets, the Cleveland Tigers, and then you have one that finally, in the right-hand column toward the top, the Cleveland Cubs finished second. You say, finally, Cleveland had a good team. Well, sort of and sort of not, because you see the Nashville Elite Giants at the bottom of the previous year, they actually split themselves up and got a whole bunch of players, and they had a team, a major league level team, the Cleveland Cubs, in the Negro National League, and still had the Nashville Elite Giants in the Negro Southern League. And so it kind of really wasn't a Cleveland team per se. Okay, now we spend our time talking about our 3 primary ones. Now, can you see me at all, or you're just seeing the PowerPoint screen?
We just see the PowerPoint screen.
Okay. Well,
so when you finish your when
I finish the talk, let's not go bouncing back and forth.
Perfect.
There's a cute reason I was asking that question. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, and you see all that blue in the runs allowed column, that was their strength. And for a number of years, actually run production was on the mediocre to low side. You can see by the red. And so there's all of that. And that presented an interesting question, because not only did they play that style of ball, playing for a run at a time, a lot of sacrifices and that sort of thing. But they also played, and their ballpark was Shoreline Park, which had the reputation of favoring defense. So my question is, okay, did Shoreline Park really make a difference? And so if you compare the Cleveland games in 1920 and 1930, Chicago rather. So 2/3 of their games were played at home, 1/3 away. That's a story in and of itself. And you can see the average runs per game of both teams, 29% runs, more runs were scored on the road than at home. So that would tend to support the idea that there were two things going on behind the low scoring games, not only the strategy of the Chicago American Giants, but also the nature of the ballpark. Now, okay. This is an interesting thing that I alluded to earlier. If you can follow along what's going on with these things. Okay, 1920. You can see they allowed 3.2 runs per game. That's really, really good. If you go off to the right, you see 0.80 and 0.895. That's them keeping their pitching staff intact. Well, what happened? It blew up to a still really good, but much higher, 4.1 runs allowed per game. And so now looking to the right, and what did they do? They really blew up their pitching staff. This was revolutionary. Pardon me, a major makeover, numbers like 0.20 and 0.31 for the two indices. And you can see that went forward through the next couple or 3 years, which was interesting. They were still really good, and Rube Foster, a pitcher himself in his playing days, kept looking for the magic elixir to make a better pitching staff. Now, here's a really cool story. You can see how going down to 1925, they're finishing first, then second, then third. They're still pretty good in 1925, 582 winning proportion, but run scoring really dropped. And so you look at that number off to the right, 0.5051, and then the 0.4s. So that tells you a pretty significant makeover, certainly more than you were seeing beforehand, except for those pitchers. And that makeover led to renewed success in 1926 and 27. Both years they won the league championship series, and both years they won the World Series, both times against the Atlantic City AC Bacharach Giant. And so, this presents a really interesting question that involves Rube Foster. So often historians, in fact, I think Nietzsche said something along the lines of most historians work their way backward, and therefore they wind up thinking backwards, and I like that. So Rube Foster in 1925, of course he's managing Chicago, he doesn't show up to the ballpark. They were in Indianapolis for a game. The players go back to the boarding house, and I find that he's passed out, I think in the bathroom. He'd hit his head. There might have been some gas leaking or something like that. Okay, keep that in mind. 1926, fairly early in the season, he goes around the bend. In fact, his wife called some players to restrain him because he was breaking all the furniture in the apartment where they lived. And then another time he was out running around in the street thinking that he was playing in a white World Series. So he was committed to an insane asylum in Kankakee, Illinois, which is where he lived out his days until he passed away in 1930. So the historians who work backwards say, well, that accident he had in Indianapolis certainly was starting to show effects, and him really tearing apart this wonderful Chicago team with those indices that I shared you. That was an early manifestation of mental illness. Now, I read that at first and took a look at the rosters, and I thought, wait a second, this sounds like the kind of thing that Branch Rickey used to do with the St. Louis Cardinals. If you got a guy who was a really good player, say a Sonny Jim Bottomley, a Joe Medwick, you wait till they're just barely on the downside of their career and you unload them and get younger guys. So which is it? Can we tell? Okay, let's take a look. 1925. Okay, my two key guys, Cristobal Torriente playing left field and Bingo DeMoss playing second base, and a number of these other guys who were good, but those are the two main ones. See you later. They're gone. That's what that turnover looks like. Look at all the blank space. And then the guys they brought in the following year, perfectly good players. Williams, Jackson, Thompson, George Sweat, Pythias, Russ. No household names. None of those people is threatening to be in the Hall of Fame. But look at the record jumping up, and the runs scored per game jumped up considerably as well. And fairly minor turnover going into 1927. And interesting, two things happened in those 2 years. Jim Brown, who was their catcher for several years, while his offense was declining, they put him at first base, saying, okay, maybe we get his offense back. That worked. And then they got Pythias Russ to catch, and then and his offense went down, but he was a good catcher. They put him at shortstop to replace Jackson, who was a lousy hitter. Anyway, the point is there was some pretty thoughtful stuff done, but and now the pitchers, okay. Look at the turnover there, including Juan Padron. How do you get rid of a guy whose adjusted ERA was 170 and is only 32 years old? Well, he was showing evidence in the second half of the season of declining, marginal, but I think worth considering, candidate for the Hall of Fame. The only guy left going into that next season was the ageless wonder George Harney. And look at all the new guys. Bill Foster, Rube's half brother, he was ready to pitch serious innings along with Webster at McDonald, and you got some new guys, and then that held forth for the following couple of years. So the answer to the question is bravo, Rube Foster. Even though he could not manage the 1926 and 1927 champs, they were his. So I have never seen in writing him being given credit for that wonderful turnaround, instead saying, well, the guy was in the throes of becoming insane. And so, yay, Rube. Now, Kansas City Monarchs, a very different story. You see any red there in those middle columns? Not at all. They were the most well-balanced, excellent team in the Negro National League, both in terms of run scoring and especially in run preventing. And you take a look at all of those numbers, I mean, you don't see any significantly low numbers in either of the Sorensen or the Morisita's index. So there was never any revolutionary makeover that took place in their history, but they did need to do some improving. Take a look at the run scoring. I mean, 5.1, you wanted to do better than that. And so you take a look at the indices, and what you saw was incremental improvement and roster change every year, and you saw the run scoring improving every year. Same thing happened with the pitching for 3 years, and back to the offense in 28 going into 29. And so the bottom line for them was incremental cumulative improvement, or if we were using the verbiage from evolutionary biology, we would say gradualism. And now, we'll show you some pretty pictures just so you can see. I mean, look at this. Jose Mendez, Bullet Rogan, both in the Hall of Fame. Donaldson and McNair, good candidates. Doby Moore, Doby. I've been using some of the local product here. Doby Moore, excellent shortstop, slam dunk for the Hall of Fame. And you can see, I'm just flipping through here so you get a sense of gradual improvement in the roster. So we get Heavy Johnson, the two of them wound up switching positions at some point. Doby Moore stuck around. Newt Allen, a good candidate for the Hall of Fame. Frank Duncan, excellent defensive catcher. And they kept their guys, and you remember what those similarity indices looked like. They had a good number of very good players who stuck around year after year after year. Same thing with the pitching staff. You just get the idea. Not any great turnover there. Okay, now, entirely different story for my St. Louis Stars. And then we'll wrap up. And so you can see most in their heyday from 1925 to 1931, the strength is offense. So then we can pose the same question we did for Chicago. There it is. And that is, did the ballpark play a role in this? Well, I haven't done that exhaustive compilation for St. Louis that I did for Chicago, but we have a suggestive little series, the 1928 Negro National League Championship Series. First 4 games were in Shoreline Park in Chicago. Average runs per game was 8. And then they move over to St. Louis to Stars Park, and the average number of games 15.4. Not statistically significant, but certainly suggestive. The left field fence, by the way, in Stars Park, if you don't know, was actually a car trolley barn, and they were constantly changed, and it was only 266 feet down the left field line, and so they were constantly changing the ground rules related to it. Did you have to hit it up on the roof to have it be a home run? Everything else was a double, and occasionally somebody would leave one of the big windows open in said trolley barn. So what do you call it when a fly ball goes through one of the windows? So all very exciting if you are an avid reader of the 1920s St. Louis Argus, black newspaper weekly. Anyhow, okay. So I warned you before that the key fun story relates to 1923 through 1925. So you can see during this period, the team was getting better. And you look at the position players turnover, it looks like it's great, and then less so. But if you read the papers, the real story comes out when you break 1923 and 1924 into 2 halves. Here's what happened. This was interesting. 1923. So there was a team in Toledo, the Toledo Tigers, in the first half of the season. They wound up playing St. Louis a fair amount, and they, I think July 9 or 10 was their last game, and they folded their tents. They were losing money. They couldn't cut it anymore. Now, the fellow who bought the St. Louis Stars in 1922, a guy named Dick Kent, he really wanted a winner. He was much more aggressive in that regard than his predecessor. And so he had become very impressed with Candy Jim Taylor, C.J. Taylor, and he said, I want this guy as my manager. And so he booted Joe Hewitt, who was also an outfielder, and brought in C.J. Taylor and said, you make me a winner here. And so Taylor was very aggressive, and you can see those numbers for the position players, those index numbers. And so big turnover between the first half of 23 and the second half of 23, and they went from 21 and 21 to 13 and 23. Not dreadfully successful right away. They had a couple decent players worth hanging on to. And then the off season going into 1924, again, more major change, getting close back to up to 500. But then the changes that were made midway through 1924 produced a team that in the post July 15, they went 25 and 17. And then between the end of 24 and 25, you can see those indices, 0.84, 0.92. They stood pat. They had a really good team on their hands. So if we look at pretty, the phrase we use in evolutionary biology is punctuated equilibrium. That's just the opposite of gradualism, where you've got a state of equilibrium and then something revolutionary happens, and then you've got a new state of equilibrium. Imagine the great meteor smacking into the Yucatan Peninsula, and the dinosaurs all go extinct, all except for one little lineage that becomes birds. So we still have dinosaurs on our hands. Anyway, that's what happened with the St. Louis Stars. So you can think about extinct dinosaurs and birds when you think of the history of the St. Louis Stars. So to see some pretty pictures, here's a pretty crummy team the first half of 1923. Well, at least they were mediocre. Nobody threatening the Hall of Fame in this bunch. And circled in red are the ones who were the added ones. I simplified this. Russell went from third base to shortstop, making room for C.J. Taylor himself to play third base. Then you got Dewey Creasy going into 1924, and Willie Bobo. Was it a great team? No, but those were 2 key players. And you had the finally Cool Papa Bell, who had been a pitcher and a pretty darn successful one, said, your skill set is more valuable to us as an outfielder. And then second half of 1924, some changes. Russell goes from shortstop to right field, making room from Willie Wells, another outstanding Hall of Famer. C.J. Taylor finally figured out, I'm not a player anymore. So he becomes a bench guy. Dewey Creasy switches from second base to third base, making room for Watts, who was an improvement there. And Frog Reedus takes over in left field. And that is pretty much the team you see in 1925. And then, as I mentioned before, for 26, we got Suttles from Birmingham and John Henry Russell from Memphis. So We'll just skip over that. I'm probably running out. Oh, we'll see what the pitchers happened. So not so much revolutionary here, but bingo. A pretty lousy pitching staff was changed considerably. Roosevelt Davis, the only guy sticking around and pitching significantly, and then pretty consistent for the following year, although the proportions of innings pitched changed. So again, punctuated equilibrium, very revolutionary history, just the opposite of what you saw in Kansas City. And then I will close with a slide of the 1931 St. Louis Stars, a really good team. Not only do you have Mule Suttles, Cool Papa Bell, and Willie Wells in the Hall of Fame, but Newt Allen, I think, is a slam dunk. George Giles should be part of the conversation, as should Ted Trent. And you look at that one-loss proportion, 787. Were they really that good? Well, they were good, but they weren't that good. One could actually make the argument, and I'm ending on kind of a downer, that the 1931 Negro National League could be considered a minor league with one really good major league equivalent team left over from before. So I call them the Negro National League's last team standing. So thank you very much for your kind attention. That wraps things up, and I hope we have a couple minutes for questions.
We always have time for questions. If you go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button, you will see raise hand. Hit that button and you can get in to ask questions of our presenter this evening, Clem Hamilton. This has been one of the most stat heavy presentations we've had since we became a chapter a couple of years ago. This is very comprehensive and detailed for sure, Clem. So I want to thank you for that.
So Bruce, has anybody else dragged most of their statistical measures from community ecology? I bet not.
I don't think they have. I have. We've got some guys in line for you for questions. Ken Edwards, you may ask your question. How you doing tonight, Ken?
Great, Bruce. How are you?
I am great.
Once again, great session, fabulous session.
Thank you.
The question that I want to ask is, to what degree are the ratios that you've identified driven by owner resources? In other words, if the Kansas City Monarchs owner had deep pockets, could that owner afford to manage incrementally the way he did? And could he afford to keep his players through simple, monetary incentives, paying them more money, versus the other teams who may not have had the resources and thus experienced turnover and having their rosters rated?
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's a really good question, and the answer goes in perhaps a slightly different direction than you're guessing. I can't think of a single one of these owners pre-depression that was independently wealthy from something else. Now, when you get to post-depression, you get the Alex Pompez's of the world, you get a whole bunch of guys who are numbers kings, and that was their source of money. And the same thing with the Pittsburgh Crawfords and whatnot. Oh, by the way, since I'm back on screen, this gives me the opportunity to wear my Chicago American Giants cap.
Perfect.
And then, of course, we've got to see, even though it's not quite the same version for Kansas City. And then, of course, my favorite, the St. Louis cap, which I will keep on for the remainder of this.
Perfect.
Anyhow, so it was more one advantage that St. Louis had. It was the only team that owned its own ballpark. So scheduling was something, everybody knew they could get a payday by coming to St. Louis, whereas these other teams, they were at the mercy of what other major or minor league team was the primary owner of the ballpark, or even in some cases, white semi-pro teams, but they still had dibs on the ballpark. Chicago, even though they didn't own Shoreling Field, they had primary control over it. So that was a really important consideration. In fact, I'd say pre-depression, that was probably the most important one. There was also the small matter of competence on the part of the owners. It's not that J.L. Wilkinson for Kansas City was that much richer or anything else, but he was smarter in scheduling. and he was absolutely regular with his paychecks, and was generous with the players, and got involved with their lives and everything, and made loans and this and that. And that was one reason. There were times later on, after the league folded and Kansas City was playing independently, and they typically would not start until the season, the organized league season, had gotten pretty well underway. And so remember, I showed you Newt Allen was playing second base for St. Louis in 1931. Well, as soon as J.L. Wilkinson said, well, okay, let's start our barnstorming again, all these guys who had gone off to play with other teams, they came streaming back to Kansas City because of that loyalty to them. So it wasn't a matter of more money, it was a lot of factors. Good question.
Thank you.
Dixie Tarango, you're up. How you doing, Dix?
All right. Clem, it has to be said that you should be awarded something for constructing those graphs and illustrating them so that we could actually understand this extremely complicated program. I actually think that I know something now because of those graphs. They were great.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
My question is about the Cuban Stars.
Yeah.
When you had them up on the screen, they were in the middle to the bottom of the list of everything. And you said they weren't quite that successful, but they might not have been successful in the record, but they certainly were successful enough to play all of those years. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the reasons is the Cuban Winter League was very successful. So there were always guys who were willing to come up, and it would change from year to year, but most of the guys who came up to North America to play either in black baseball or white baseball, they might have taken some years off occasionally, but still, that was a great opportunity for them. And as much as, let's put it this way, if there were just one Cuban Stars team, oh, and my goodness, if Torriente and Mendez had played for that the Cuban team as well, it would have been a really, really good team.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I may have gone off on a tangent on you there, but yeah, I didn't mean to. Yeah, the fact that they could succeed despite not having a home ballpark, that's pretty darned impressive. So, okay.
Let's go to Gary Joquin.
Yeah, it is a very interesting presentation. I echo the comments that have been expressed so far. I'm curious about three things. What tools did you use to perform your analysis and present the content? When did you first become interested in this era? And what was the hook? Was there an aha moment that you had that ignited your interest?
Oh, okay. I'll work backwards, and you'll have to remind me what the first one is. So the hook. Oh, when I became interested, actually the 50th anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking the color line in the minor leagues, which of course would have been 1996. I did some analysis of the process of integration, and actually SABR sponsored a conference at held at Bethune-Cookman College near where that spring training took place when Robinson was playing with the Montreal Royals, and meeting all these folks whose stuff I'd been reading that was done right. I mean, you all know what it's like being in SABR and how welcoming folks are, and that was a pretty darned important thing. And actually, come to think of it, it also became a justification for my baseball card collection, because I could claim, erroneously of course, that it was contributing to my research. In fact, it was a 1953 Roy Campanella card that was the Bowman card that was so pretty, knocked my socks off, and that's what hooked me when I saw that in the cabinet. I know, not very intellectual reaction to that. Let's see, the third part. Hooking into that period, it's because I'm living in St. Louis, and that was the St. Louis Stars, and the fact that post-Depression, there was never again significant high-quality black baseball in St. Louis. There were St. Louis Stars teams that did most of their home playing across the river in Illinois. And then what was the first question?
What tools did you use to perform your analysis and present it?
Oh, I just, to perform the analysis, mostly just wraps and wraps of Excel spreadsheets. And the raw data came from Baseball Reference and actually much more from Seam Heads, which is more complete than Baseball Reference because it's in the process of being changed. But Baseball Reference just has blackball information from the recognized leagues. So if you were a really good team playing independently, your stuff doesn't show up yet in Baseball Reference, whereas it does show up in Seam Heads. So I got most of my raw data from Seam Heads.
And so the presentation was a very painstaking and animated PowerPoint?
Yeah. Yep.
Well done.
Thank you. I mean, nobody's used the phrase anal retentive yet, so this is good.
Oh no.
Well, that's how I describe myself. So.
Oh, I know. We regard that as a compliment.
We might have thought it, but we didn't.
That's all right.
Ouch. Okay.
Or else I wouldn't have said it.
Alex here.
You're forgetting that this is SABR and this is normal.
That's
well taken.
Fastidious or you know.
Thank you. We'll go with fastidious.
I like fastidious. I think baseball is an emotional game, and you form an emotional attachment to it, and then over time, the intellectualism becomes more prevalent for a lot of fans out there.
Feed each other, and then you hook up to the stories. When I lead tour, my retirement job is leading tours in Busch Stadium, and we have a photograph of the 1928 St. Louis Stars in the Cardinals Club, you know, the fancy schmancy club with the green seats right behind home plate. And I always pause. I'm the only guy who does pause and tells a little bit about the St. Louis Stars. And one story I loved, I mean, everybody, cool Papa Bell, turn the lights out, he's in bed, blah, blah, blah. We've all heard that a million times. But I love to tell how Willie Wells, the great shortstop, would discourage people from breaking up the double play by putting rocks in the fingers of his glove. So if you had the sharpened spikes and came sliding in, you'd get a fistful of rocks and you wouldn't do that again. So, you know, again, it's the intellect and the emotion feeding each other.
All right. So the next time we have a SABR convention in St. Louis, we're going to make sure that Clem gives the ballpark tour because it's going to be the best ballpark tour ever.
And I never.
All right. Wednesday. What's that? What's that, Clem?
Say what? I never invent more than 20% of what I share with them.
Love it. That makes it perfect. All right. Wednesday night, 7:00 Eastern, SABR's East Coast Cooperative, a coalition of 7 chapters throughout the Northeast, will be back with another great presenter for you. Don Slavic will be with us to give his SABR 52 presentation. A hit model from the MLB 2023 season are the things they call ground balls still outs. And a week from tonight, Monday, September 30th, you are not going to want to miss this one. My good friend Vince Guerreri will be with us to give his SABR 52 presentation. 10-cent beer night, a date that will live in infamy. I've seen this presentation. It's fantastic. That'll be 7 p.m. Eastern, both nights. All meetings are listed in the SABR events calendar. And finally, if you're watching this on YouTube and you like what we're doing, please like and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our uploads. And if you're a baseball fan watching this, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community, offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom. SABR boasts more than 35 different research communities, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org/join today. Clem Hamilton, you're amazing. That was fantastic. Nice round of applause. You could see everybody's giving you a little round of applause in there. That was fantastic. I hope you're going to be able to do this for more chapters, and you were great. Thank you very much.
Time to feed the kiddies.
Time to feed the kiddies. Let's get everybody out of here. We'll see you Wednesday night. Have a great night, everybody.